A woman stood at register 4 of a Piggly Wiggly in Valdosta, Georgia, staring at the total on the screen. $43.17. She had $42 in her hand. She started pulling items off the belt: the milk, the cereal, the bananas her daughter liked. Behind her, a man in a faded olive jacket reached past her and placed a single worn dollar bill on the counter. "That should cover it," he said quietly. The woman turned to thank him, but he was already walking away, hands in his pockets, head down, moving toward the automatic doors like a man who had practiced the art of disappearing. She never got his name. She didn't see his face clearly. All she saw was the back of a green jacket and a pair of boots that looked like they'd walked 1,000 miles past their expiration date. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, comment "sacrifice" right now, because what this woman discovers about that dollar will break your heart and rebuild it in the same breath. Her name was Jessica Reyes, and she was 31 years old, and 14 months ago she had been a military wife with a 3-bedroom house on base at Moody Air Force Base, and a husband who called her every night from wherever the Marine Corps sent him. Staff Sergeant Alejandro Alex Reyes had been a Marine for 12 years, an infantryman who had deployed 4 times and re-enlisted twice because he believed in the work the way some people believe in gravity. Not as an opinion, but as a fact of the universe. Alex was killed in a training accident at Camp Lejeune in October of the previous year. A vehicle rollover during a night exercise. He was 33 years old. He left behind Jessica, their 7-year-old daughter Lucia, and a flag folded into a triangle that now sat on a shelf in a rental apartment Jessica could barely afford on the survivor benefits that had taken the Defense Finance and Accounting Service 4 months to process. Jessica didn't talk about the money. She didn't talk about how the service members' group life insurance had been delayed because of a paperwork error that listed her maiden name instead of her married name. She didn't talk about how she'd moved off base into an apartment in Valdosta because the on-base housing office told her she had 90 days to vacate after Alex's death, and the 90 days had felt like 9. She talked about Lucia. She talked about getting through the week. She talked about the grocery list and the electric bill and the school supplies and all the small, ordinary emergencies that fill the days of a woman holding a family together with 2 hands and no safety net. The dollar at the register was the first time in 14 months that a stranger had done something kind for her without asking for her story first, and it undid her in the parking lot. She sat in her car with the groceries in the back seat and cried for 10 minutes, not because of the dollar, but because of what the dollar meant. That someone had seen her struggling and helped without being asked and without wanting credit, and she had forgotten that people did that. The man in the green jacket was named Arthur Mead. He was 61 years old, and the dollar he had placed on the counter was, in the most literal sense, the last dollar he had. Not the last dollar in his wallet, the last dollar to his name. Arthur had found it that morning in the pocket of a pair of pants donated to the Lowndes County Salvation Army, where he'd been sleeping on a cot for the past 5 weeks. He had put the crumpled bill in his jacket pocket and considered it a small piece of luck, enough for a cup of coffee from the gas station on North Ashley Street, or a pack of crackers from the dollar store. He had been on his way to spend it when he stopped at the Piggly Wiggly to use the restroom, which was the actual reason most homeless people entered grocery stores, a fact that most grocery stores understood and most customers preferred not to think about. On his way back out, he had passed register 4 and seen the woman pulling items off the belt with the quiet, practiced humiliation of someone who had counted wrong and now had to choose in front of strangers which food her family would go without. Arthur hadn't thought about it. He didn't calculate. He didn't weigh the coffee against the cereal. He just reached into his pocket and put the bill on the counter. Because something in him, something that predated the homelessness and the poverty and the decades of slow ruin, recognized a person in need and responded the way he had been trained to respond, immediately, without hesitation, and without concern for personal cost. Arthur Mead had been trained by the United States Army. He had enlisted in 1982 at the age of 18, a kid from rural Tift County, Georgia, who had never left the state, and whose father had told him on the day he shipped out that the army was the best thing that would ever happen to a boy with no money and no prospects. His father had been right, for a while. Arthur served 20 years. He was an infantryman first, then a combat medic after he discovered that his hands, which shook when he held a rifle, were perfectly steady when he held a bandage. He deployed to Panama in 1989, to the Gulf in 1991, to Somalia in 1993, and to Iraq in 2003. His final deployment, the one that came 6 months before his retirement at the rank of Sergeant First Class. In Iraq, Arthur's convoy was hit by an improvised explosive device outside Fallujah. The blast killed the driver and the gunner. Arthur, riding in the back, survived with a traumatic brain injury, bilateral hearing loss, and a left leg that was rebuilt with titanium rods and never worked quite right again. He received a Purple Heart, an Army Commendation Medal with Valor device, and a medical retirement with full benefits. He was 40 years old. For the first few years, the benefits held. Arthur lived in a small house in Tifton, Georgia, managed his VA appointments, took his medications, and existed in the strange, muffled afterlife of a career soldier with no career left. He didn't have a wife. He'd been married briefly in the early 90s to a woman named Patrice, who told him she hadn't signed up to be alone 11 months out of 12, and she'd been right about that too. No children, a few friends from the service who called on holidays and then stopped calling. The traumatic brain injury manifested slowly, the way those injuries do, not as a single dramatic collapse, but as a gradual fogging of the systems that keep a life organised. He missed a VA appointment, then two. His medication refills lapsed. He forgot to pay the property tax. Then he forgot he'd forgotten. By 2016, the house was in foreclosure. By 2017, he was in a shelter in Valdosta, 60 miles from the house he'd lost, carrying a backpack with his discharge papers, his medications, and a small Bible his mother had given him the day he enlisted. The Purple Heart was still in the backpack. He hadn't pawned it, not out of pride, but because it never occurred to him that it was worth anything to anyone other than the men it was meant to honour, the driver and the gunner, who hadn't come home. Arthur had been in Valdosta for 4 years. He cycled between the Salvation Army shelter, a tent camp near the railroad tracks on East Hill Avenue, and the occasional motel room when the VA managed to process a temporary housing voucher before it expired. He ate at the soup kitchen on Toombs Street 3 days a week. He picked up day labour when his leg allowed it, which was less and less often as the years compounded the damage the surgeons had warned him about. He was quiet. The shelter staff knew him as polite, reliable, clean, and almost completely silent. He made his cot with hospital corners every morning. He helped with dishes without being asked. He never raised his voice. He never complained. He was the kind of man institutions describe as no trouble, which is another way of saying he was the kind of man institutions could easily forget. And the dollar he gave Jessica Reyes at Register 4 of the Piggly Wiggly was the last tangible thing he owned besides the clothes on his back and the contents of his backpack. And he gave it away in under 3 seconds, without a moment's hesitation. Because Arthur Meade had spent 20 years learning that you give what you have when someone needs it, and the amount doesn't matter, and the cost to yourself doesn't matter. And the only thing that matters is that you saw the need, and you moved toward it instead of away. Jessica didn't think about the man in the green jacket again until 3 days later. She was at the VFW post on Baytree Road, attending a support group for Gold Star families that met every other Thursday evening. The group was run by a woman named Helen Marsh, 64 years old, a Gold Star mother herself whose son had been killed in Afghanistan in 2011. Helen ran the group with a combination of ferocious tenderness and absolute intolerance for platitudes, which was why Jessica kept coming back. That evening, another member of the group, a woman named Sandra, whose husband had died of complications from Agent Orange exposure, mentioned something offhand during the discussion. Sandra volunteered at the Salvation Army shelter on Victory Drive and had been talking about the veterans she encountered there. "There's one man," Sandra said, "who's been there on and off for years. Army veteran, did 20 years, has a Purple Heart he keeps in his backpack. Nicest man you'll ever meet, but he's got nothing. I mean, nothing. I saw him yesterday and he told me he gave his last dollar to a woman at the grocery store because she was short on her bill." Sandra shook her head and half smiled. "That's the kind of man he is. He's got nothing, and he still gives." Jessica felt something cold move through her chest. "What does he look like?" Sandra described him. Olive green jacket, tall, lean, slight limp, grey beard, kept short, quiet voice, doesn't make eye contact. Jessica's hands tightened in her lap. "That was me," she whispered. "He gave that dollar to me." The room went quiet. Helen leaned forward. Sandra stared. Jessica told them what had happened at the Piggly Wiggly, the total, the dollar, the man walking away before she could say thank you. Sandra nodded slowly. "That's Arthur. Arthur Mead. He wouldn't have told you his name. He wouldn't have told you anything. That's just how he is." Jessica asked where she could find him. Sandra hesitated, then said the shelter, most mornings, before they cleared the cots at 7. Jessica was there the next morning at 6:30. She brought a bag of groceries, not the kind of groceries you buy for charity, the generic, bulk, utilitarian kind. She brought the kind of groceries you buy for a person. Coffee, real coffee, not instant. Bread from the bakery, sliced turkey, a bag of apples, a bar of dark chocolate, because Sandra had mentioned Arthur had a sweet tooth he never indulged. She asked the front desk for Arthur Mead. The volunteer on duty, a young man named Curtis, looked at her carefully and asked how she knew Arthur. Jessica told him. Curtis went to the back and returned a few minutes later with Arthur, who walked into the lobby with the measured, cautious gait of a man whose leg hurt more than he would admit, and whose instinct in unfamiliar social situations was to maintain a clear path to the exit. Arthur recognized her immediately. Not her face exactly, but the situation. The woman from the register. He stopped a few feet away, and his posture shifted into something Jessica recognized because she had seen it in Alex 1,000 times. The almost imperceptible stiffening of a man who has been caught doing something he considers private and is bracing for a conversation he didn't plan for. Jessica held out the bag. "This is for you," she said. Arthur looked at the bag, then at her. "Mum, you don't owe me anything." "I know I don't," Jessica said. "That's not why I'm here." She paused. "I came because I found out you gave me the only dollar you had, and I want to understand why." Arthur was quiet for a long time. The lobby of the Salvation Army shelter at 6:45 in the morning is not a place designed for meaningful conversation. People moved around them, cots were being folded, the coffee urn hissed and gurgled. Arthur shifted his weight off his bad leg. "You were short," he said simply, "and your daughter was with you. I could see her in the cart." Jessica felt her throat tighten. Lucia had been sitting in the cart that day, holding a stuffed rabbit and singing quietly to herself the way she did when she was bored. "You saw her?" Arthur nodded. "She reminded me of someone. I don't know who. Maybe nobody specific. Just a kid who needed her mom to have a good day." He paused. $1 can do that sometimes. Give someone a good day. It's not much, but it's something. Jessica stood there with the bag of groceries in her hands and understood with perfect clarity that this man, who had nothing, who slept on a cot in a shelter and limped on a leg held together with metal rods, and carried a purple heart in a backpack because he didn't consider it worth selling, had looked at her and seen not a stranger, but a mission, a person in need. And he had executed that mission with the same precision and selflessness that had defined his entire life, even though the cost to him was everything he had. Jessica didn't leave. She sat down with Arthur at one of the shelter's folding tables, and they talked for 2 hours. Arthur didn't talk easily, and the conversation had long pauses and dead ends, and moments where his eyes went somewhere far away, and Jessica waited, the way you wait for someone walking on unsteady ground, without rushing and without reaching out unless they ask. Arthur told her about the army, about the 20 years, about Fallujah and the IED and the driver and the gunner, about the TBI and the slow fog and the house and the foreclosure and the shelter. He told it the way a man tells a story he's never told in full before, with surprise at his own voice, as if hearing it out loud made it real in a way that carrying it silently had not. And then Jessica told Arthur about Alex. She told him about the 12 years of service and the 4 deployments, and the phone calls every night, and the training accident, and the folded flag, and the apartment in Valdosta, and the grocery bill she couldn't cover. And when she told him, Arthur went very still. His jaw tightened, and his hands pressed flat against the table. He was a Marine? Arthur nodded slowly to himself, not as a question, but as a confirmation of something he had already sensed. I could tell. When I saw you at the register, I don't know how to explain it. You had the look families get when they've been carrying something alone for too long. Jessica asked what he meant. Arthur thought about it. Like you were at attention, he said, even though nobody was watching. Holding yourself together because falling apart wasn't an option. I've seen it my whole life. In soldiers, in families, in the mirror. He paused. That's why I gave you the $1. Not because you needed it, because he would have wanted someone to. Jessica Reyes was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. She was methodical, careful, trained by 14 months of crisis to think 3 steps ahead and trust nothing that hadn't been verified. But something about Arthur Mead, about the way he sat across a folding table in a homeless shelter and spoke about her dead husband with the reverence of a man addressing a fallen brother he'd never met, unlocked a door in her that she hadn't known was closed. She asked Arthur if he'd be willing to come to dinner at her apartment the following Sunday. Arthur said no. Jessica asked again the following week. Arthur said no again. Jessica asked a third time, and this time she brought Lucia with her to the shelter. Lucia walked up to Arthur with the confidence unique to 7-year-olds who haven't yet learned to be afraid of strangers and said, "My mum says you helped us at the store. Do you want to come eat with us? She's making arroz con pollo and it's really good." Arthur looked at the little girl. Then he looked at Jessica. His chin dipped and his eyes went bright and his voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. What time? Dinner at the Reyes apartment was not remarkable. That was what made it extraordinary. Jessica cooked, Lucia set the table, insisting on placing the forks on the wrong side and being gently corrected by Arthur, who showed her the proper placement and then, at her request, showed her how to fold napkins into triangles the way they did in the mess hall. They ate. Arthur complimented the food 3 times, which was 2 more times than he had complimented anything in recent memory. Lucia showed him her stuffed rabbit collection, naming each one with the grave seriousness of a museum curator. Arthur listened to every name and repeated them back, which delighted Lucia and astonished Jessica, because Arthur's TBI made short-term memory unpredictable, and the fact that he was concentrating hard enough to retain the names of 7 stuffed rabbits told her something about how much this evening mattered to him. After dinner, Lucia went to her room to read, and Arthur and Jessica sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Jessica asked Arthur a question she'd been holding since the shelter. "Arthur, what do you need? Honestly. Not what the VA says you need or what the shelter provides. What do you actually need to get off the street?" Arthur stared into his coffee for a long time. "I need someone to help me with the paperwork," he said quietly. "I can't track it anymore. The forms, the appointments, the deadlines. It all slides around in my head and I lose things. Important things. That's how I lost the house. I didn't forget to care. I forgot to file." It was the most honest thing Arthur had said in years, possibly decades. The admission that his brain, the one organ no amount of military discipline could force into compliance, had been quietly failing him for 20 years, and that the failure was not laziness or indifference but damage, real physical damage, the kind that doesn't show up on the outside and doesn't generate sympathy the way a missing limb does. Jessica Reyes was not a social worker. She was not a VA caseworker or a therapist or a benefits coordinator. She was a 31-year-old widow and mother who had spent the last 14 months fighting her own bureaucratic wars with DFAs and SGLI and housing offices and school enrollment forms. But she knew something that Arthur didn't know, and that the systems designed to help him had never figured out. She knew how to make phone calls and not hang up. She knew how to sit on hold for 40 minutes and then calmly explain a situation to the third person she'd been transferred to. She knew how to print forms and fill them out in triplicate and drive them to an office and stand at a counter and say, politely but immovably, "I'm not leaving until someone looks at this." Jessica told Arthur she would help him. Arthur told her she didn't have to. Jessica said she knew that. Then she took out a notebook and a pen and said, "Start from the beginning. Every claim you filed, every benefit you were told you qualified for, every appointment you missed, and every form you lost. We're going to write it all down, and then we're going to fix it." They sat at that kitchen table until midnight. Arthur talked and Jessica wrote, and by the time they were done, she had 11 pages of notes, and Arthur had the look of a man who had just set down a rucksack he'd been carrying for 20 years. The process took 5 months. Jessica contacted the Valdosta VA clinic and got Arthur reassigned to a patient advocate named Denise Franklin, who pulled his medical records and discovered that his TBI rating had been assessed at 10% in 2004, a number so low it was functionally insulting and medically indefensible given the documented severity of the blast. Denise filed for a re-evaluation. Jessica contacted the Lowndes County Veterans Service Office and connected Arthur with a benefits counsellor who specialised in housing assistance for chronically homeless veterans. The counsellor, a retired Army First Sergeant named Roy Perkins, took one look at Arthur's file and said words that Jessica would remember for the rest of her life. This man should have been in housing 5 years ago. The system didn't fail him once, it failed him continuously. The disability re-evaluation came back 4 months later. Arthur's TBI rating was increased from 10% to 70%. His combined disability rating, including the leg, the hearing loss, and the TBI, was adjusted to 90%. The back pay alone, calculated from the date the original rating should have been corrected, was enough to cover a security deposit, first and last month's rent, and 6 months of living expenses. Roy Perkins processed a HUD-VASH housing voucher. Denise Franklin coordinated with a neurologist at the VA Medical Center in Dublin, Georgia, who prescribed medication and cognitive therapy that Arthur had qualified for since 2004 and never received. And Jessica Reyes, who had started this entire chain of events because a man put $1 on a counter, drove Arthur to every single appointment, sat in every waiting room, made every follow-up call, and refused, categorically and permanently, to let the system lose him again. Arthur moved into an apartment on North Forest Street in Valdosta in August. It was a 1-bedroom, ground floor, 8 minutes by car from Jessica's apartment. Jessica and Lucia helped him move in, which took about 20 minutes because Arthur's possessions still fit in a single backpack. Lucia insisted on placing a stuffed rabbit on his nightstand, one from her own collection, a small brown one she had named Sergeant. "So you won't be lonely," she said. Arthur held the rabbit and looked at it for a long time and said, "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll take good care of him." Jessica hung a small shelf in the living room. On it, Arthur placed his Purple Heart, his discharge papers in a frame Lucia had picked out at the dollar store, and a photograph Jessica had taken on her phone the previous week, printed at the Walgreens on Baytree Road. The photograph showed Arthur and Lucia sitting on the steps of Jessica's apartment building, Lucia showing Arthur one of her rabbits, Arthur's head bent toward her, listening. It was not a photograph of a homeless man and a stranger's child. It was a photograph of a family, not the kind that forms in the usual way, but the kind that forms when two broken things fit together and discover they were never broken in the same place. Word of Arthur's story spread in the way that stories spread in small communities, not through news articles or social media posts, but through conversations at the VFW and the shelter and the VA waiting room and the Thursday night Gold Star group. Helen Marsh, who ran the group, invited Arthur to attend a meeting as a guest. He declined 3 times. Jessica asked him on the 4th attempt, and he went. He sat in the back of the room in a folding chair with his hands on his knees and listened to spouses and parents talk about the people they had lost. And when Helen asked if he wanted to say anything, Arthur shook his head. But after the meeting, he approached Helen privately and said, "I'd like to come back. Not to talk, but if any of these families need help, things fixed, errands run, someone to be there, I can do that. I'm good at that." Helen looked at him for a long moment and said, "Arthur, you're already doing that. You just don't know it yet." Arthur became a quiet, permanent fixture of the Gold Star support group. He never spoke during meetings. He never shared his own story. But he showed up every Thursday without fail, and after meetings, he was the person who walked members to their cars, who carried groceries for the older parents, who changed the tyre on Sandra's car in the VFW parking lot one rainy evening without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. He mowed the lawn at Jessica's apartment complex. He fixed the leaking faucet in Helen's kitchen. He assembled a bookshelf for a Gold Star father named George, who had arthritis in both hands and couldn't grip the screwdriver. Arthur did these things because they needed to be done, and because he could do them, and because the 20 years he spent in the army had taught him that service is not a chapter of your life. It is your life, and it does not end when the uniform comes off. Lucia grew close to Arthur in the way that children grow close to people who are reliably, unshakably present. She began calling him abuelo, the Spanish word for grandfather, not because anyone suggested it, but because that is what he was to her in every way that mattered. Arthur didn't correct her. The first time she said it, he looked at Jessica with an expression of such raw, undefended bewilderment that Jessica had to turn away so he wouldn't see her cry. Abuelo Arthur attended Lucia's school play. He sat in the front row. Lucia played a tree. She had one line. Arthur told her afterward that it was the best line in the whole show, and he meant it. He helped Lucia with her homework on Tuesday evenings at Jessica's kitchen table, and he was patient in the way that only someone with significant cognitive challenges can be patient with a child who is learning, because he understood what it felt like to struggle with something your brain should be able to do easily, and he never, not once, made her feel bad about getting something wrong. For her 8th birthday, Arthur gave Lucia a gift. It was wrapped in newspaper, the way Arthur wrapped everything, with precise military folds. Inside was a small wooden box he had made by hand in the workshop at the VFW, sanded smooth, with Lucia's initials carved into the lid. Inside the box was a note. It read, "For keeping the things that matter, love, Abuelo Arthur." Lucia kept the box on her nightstand next to Sergeant the Rabbit. Inside it she placed a photograph of her father in his marine dress blues, a friendship bracelet her best friend had given her, and the grocery receipt from the Piggly Wiggly, the one from the day a stranger's last dollar changed her mother's life. Jessica had kept the receipt. She didn't know why at the time. Now she did. On a Thursday evening in November, almost 2 years after the dollar at the register, the Gold Star Group held its annual remembrance gathering at the VFW. Families brought photographs of their loved ones. Candles were lit. Names were read aloud. Arthur sat in his usual chair in the back. When it came time for families to speak, Jessica stood and walked to the front of the room. She held a framed photograph of Alex in his dress blues. She spoke about him for 3 minutes. His laugh, his discipline, his nightly phone calls, the way he made Lucia giggle by pretending to eat her stuffed rabbits. Then she paused and looked toward the back of the room. "I want to talk about someone else tonight," she said. "Someone in this room. A man who served 20 years and lost almost everything. A man who had $1 left in the world and gave it to a stranger at a grocery store because he saw a military family struggling and couldn't walk past. A man who never met my husband, but honoured him more in that single moment than any ceremony or folded flag ever could. Because Alex would have done the same thing. Alex would have given the $1. Alex would have walked away without giving his name. And when I found that man and asked him why he did it, he told me something I will never forget. He said, because he would have wanted someone to." Jessica's voice broke. She steadied herself. "Arthur Meade didn't know my husband. He didn't know me. He didn't know my daughter. But he knew what it meant to serve, and he knew that service doesn't have a discharge date. Arthur, you didn't just give me $1. You gave my daughter a grandfather. You gave me a reason to believe that the world still has people in it who will do the right thing when it costs them everything they have. And I need you to hear this, because I know you won't say it about yourself. You are the bravest man I have ever met, and Alex would have been proud to know you." The room was silent. Arthur sat in his chair with his hands on his knees, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. Helen Marsh stood and began to clap. Then Sandra. Then George. Then every person in the room on their feet, applauding a man who had given away his last $1 and gained a family he never expected. Because that is what happens when you stop calculating what you can afford to give and simply give what you have. Arthur Meade lived in the apartment on North Forest Street for the rest of his days. He kept it the way he kept everything, with precision and care. The Purple Heart stayed on the shelf. Sergeant the Stuffed Rabbit stayed on the nightstand. The photograph of himself and Lucia stayed in its frame, and beside it, Jessica placed a second photograph, one taken at the VFW Remembrance Gathering. Arthur sitting in his chair with Lucia on his lap, both of them holding candles, the light catching the old soldier's face in a way that made him look exactly like what he was, a man who had finally come home. Every Thursday he went to the Gold Star group. Every Tuesday he sat at Jessica's kitchen table with Lucia and her homework. Every Sunday they ate dinner together, the three of them, and sometimes Helen came, and sometimes Sandra, and sometimes Roy Perkins from the Veterans Service Office, who had become something between a friend and a brother to Arthur, in the quiet, uncomplicated way that veterans become family when they stop pretending they don't need one. Arthur never talked about the dollar. When people brought it up, he shrugged and changed the subject. It was not modesty, not exactly. It was something deeper. Arthur Mead understood something that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn, that the size of a gift has nothing to do with its cost, that a single dollar placed on a counter by a hand that has nothing left to give is worth more than $1,000 given by a hand that will never feel the loss. That generosity is not what you give from your surplus. Generosity is what you give from your last. And that every act of genuine kindness, no matter how small, sends a ripple through the world that you cannot see and cannot predict and cannot stop, and it will find the people who need it most, and it will bring them together, and it will build something that nothing, not poverty, not grief, not bureaucracy, not the slow erosion of a damaged brain, not a single damn thing this world can throw at a person, can tear apart. The world is full of Arthur Meads. Men and women who have nothing and give it anyway. Veterans who come home and disappear into the cracks and still, somehow, find it in themselves to reach out and hold someone else steady. The next time you see someone at a register counting coins, someone in a worn jacket walking with a limp, someone sitting alone at a shelter waiting for nothing in particular, remember that you might be looking at the most generous person in the room. You just don't know it yet. If this story reminded you that $1 can change a life, and one person can build a family out of nothing but presence and sacrifice, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories the world walks past. Share this video with someone who gives more than they have, because they need to know that it matters. It always matters, and it always will.